I mean, it's such a fascinating idea of a drop of oil, and I guess it would dissolve in water. It wouldn't dissolve in water. So what?
Precisely. So why not? So
Why not?
why not? Yeah.
And how do you mathematically describe? I mean, it's such a beautiful idea, and also the idea of like where does the drop of oil end,
Yeah.
and where does
Yeah.
it begin?
But what you can do is, this is the deflationary part of it. Can I just qualify my answer by saying that normally when I'm asked this question, I answer from the point of view of a psychologist, and we talk about
Yes.
predictive processing and predictive coding and the brain as an inference machine. But you haven't asked me from that perspective. I'm answering from the point of view of a physicist. So the question is not so much why, but if it exists, what properties must it display? So that's the deflationary part of the free energy principle. The free energy principle does not supply an answer as to why. It's saying if something exists, then it must display these properties. That's the sort of the thing that's on offer. And it so happens that these properties it must display are actually intriguing and have this inferential gloss, this sort of self-evidencing gloss that inherits from the fact that the very preservation of the boundary between the oil drop and the not oil drop requires an optimization of a particular function or a functional that defines the presence of the existence of this oil drop, which is why I started with existential imperatives. It is a necessary condition for existence that this must occur, because the boundary basically defines the thing that's existing. So it is that self-assembly aspect. It's that that you were hinting at. In biology, sometimes known as autopoiesis, in computational chemistry with self-assembly. It's the what does it look like? Sorry, how would you describe things that configure themselves out of nothing, where they clearly demarcate themselves from the states or the soup in which they are immersed? So from the point of view of computational chemistry, for example, you would just understand that as a configuration of a macromolecule to minimize its free energy, its thermodynamic free energy. It's exactly the same principle that we've been talking about, that thermodynamic free energy is just the negative elbow. It's the same mathematical construct. So the very emergence of existence, of structure, of form that can be distinguished from the environment or the thing that is not the thing, necessitates the existence of an objective function that it looks as if it is minimizing. It's finding a free energy minima.
You kind of drew a line between living and existing.
Yeah.
Is there an interesting sort of
distinction
between
the
two?
I think there is. Things do exist: grains of sand, rocks on the moon, trees, so all of these things can be separated from the environment in which they are immersed, and therefore they must at some level be optimizing their free energy, taking this sort of model evidence interpretation of this quantity. That basically means they're self-evidencing. Another nice little twist of phrase here is that you are your own existence proof, statistically speaking, which so the step through to answer your question about what's it good for, we go along the following lines. First of all, you have to define what it means to exist, which now, as you've rightly pointed out, you have to define what probabilistic properties must the states of something possess so that it knows where it finishes. And then you write that down in terms of statistical independencies. Again, sparsity. Again, it's not what's connected or what's correlated or what depends upon what. It's what's not correlated and what doesn't depend upon something. Again, it comes down to the deep structures, not in this instance hierarchical, but certainly the structures that emerge from removing connectivity and dependency. And in this instance, basically being able to identify the surface of the oil drop from the water in which it is immersed. And when you do that, you start to realize, well, there are actually four kinds of states in any given universe that contains anything. The things that are internal to the surface, the things that are external to the surface, and the surface in and of itself, which is why I use a metaphor of a little single-celled organism that has an interior and exterior, and then the surface of the cell. And that's mathematically a Markov blanket.
Just
This surface or this blanket, these blanket states that are this, because they are now defined in relation to these independences and what different states, internal or blanket or external states, can which ones can influence each other and which cannot influence each other. You can now apply standard results that you would find in non-equilibrium physics or steady state or thermodynamics or hydrodynamics, usually out of equilibrium solutions, and apply them to this partition. And what it looks like is if all the normal gradient flows that you would associate with any non-equilibrium system apply in such a way that part of the Markov blanket and the internal states seem to be hill climbing or doing a gradient descent on the same quantity. And that means that you can now describe the very existence of this oil drop. You can write down the existence of this oil drop in terms of flows, dynamics, equations of motion, where the blanket states, or part of them, we call them active states, and the internal states now seem to be and must be trying to look as if they're minimizing the same function, which is a log probability of occupying these states. The interesting thing is that what would they be called if you were trying to describe these things? So what we're talking about are internal states, external states, and blanket states. Now let's carve the blanket states into two: sensory states and active states. Operationally, it has to be the case that in order for this carving up into different sets of states to exist, the active states, the Markov blanket, cannot be influenced by the external states. And we already know that the internal states can't be influenced by the external states because the blanket separates them. So what does that mean? Well, it means the active states, the internal states, are now jointly not influenced by external states. They only have autonomous dynamics. So now you've got a picture of an oil drop that has autonomy. It has autonomous states. It has autonomous states in the sense that there must be some parts of the surface of the oil drop that are not influenced by the external states and all the interior. And together those two states endow even a little oil drop with autonomous states that look as if they are optimizing their variational free energy or their negative elbow, their model evidence. And that would be an interesting intellectual exercise. And you could say, you could even go into the realms of panpsychism, that everything that exists is implicitly making inferences or self-evidencing. Now we make the next move. But what about living things? I mean, so Let me ask you, what's the difference between an oil drop and a little tadpole or a little larva or a plankton?
What made me feel like an oil drop is a living, certainly an autonomous system, but almost a living system. So it has a capability, sensory capabilities and acting capabilities, and it maintains something. So what is the difference between that and something that we traditionally think of as a living system? That it could die, or it can't. I mean, yeah, mortality. I'm not exactly sure. I'm not sure what the right answer there is, because it can move. Like movement seems like an essential element to being able to act in the environment. But the oil drop is doing that, so I don't know.
Is it? The oil drop will be moved, but does it in and of itself move autonomously?
Well, the surface is performing actions that maintain its structure.
So where does that movement come from? If it comes from the inside, then you've got, I think, something that's living.
What do you mean from the inside?
What I mean is that the internal states that can influence the active states, where the active states can influence, but they're not influenced by the external states, can cause movement. So there are two types of oil drops, if you like. There are oil drops where the internal states are so random that they average themselves away.
I see.
And the thing cannot, on balance, on average, when you do the averaging, move. So a nice example of that would be the sun. The sun certainly has internal states. There's lots of intrinsic autonomous activity going on. But because it's not coordinated, because it doesn't have the deep, in the millennial sense, a hierarchical structure that the brain does, there is no overall mode or pattern or organization that expresses itself on the surface that allows it to actually swim. It can certainly have a very active surface, but en masse, at the scale of the actual surface of the sun, the average position of that surface cannot in itself move, because the internal dynamics are more like a hot gas. They are literally like a hot gas. Whereas your internal dynamics are much more structured and deeply structured. And now you can express on your Markov and your active states with your muscles and your secretory organs, your autonomic nervous system and its effectors. You can actually move. Mm-hmm. And that's all you can do. And that's something which, if you haven't thought of it like this before, I think it's nice to just realize there is no other way that you can change the universe other than simply moving. Whether that moving is articulating with my voice box, or walking around, or squeezing juices out of my secretory organs, there's only one way you can change the universe. It's moving.
And the fact that you do so non-randomly makes you alive.
Yeah. So it's that non-randomness. So that's what. So it is, and that would be manifest. It would be realized in terms of essentially swimming, essentially moving, changing one's shape, a morphogenesis that is dynamic and possibly adaptive. So that's what I was trying to get at between the difference between the oil drop and the little tadpole. That the tadpole is moving around. Its active states are actually changing the external states, and there's now a cycle, an action perception cycle, if you like, a recurrent dynamic that's going on that depends upon this deeply structured autonomous behavior that rests upon internal dynamics that are not only modeling the data impressed upon their surface or the blanket states, but they are actively resampling those data by moving. They're moving towards, chemical gradients and chemotaxis. So they've gone beyond just being good little models of the kind of world they live in. For example, an oil droplet could, in a panpsychic sense, be construed as a little being that has now perfectly inferred it's a passive, non-living oil drop living in a bowl of water. No problem. But to now equip that oil drop with the ability to go out and test that hypothesis about different states of beings, so it can actually push its surface over there, and test for chemical gradients, or then you start to move to a much more lifelike form. This is all fun, theoretically interesting, but it actually is quite important in terms of reflecting what I have seen since the turn of the millennium, which is this move towards an inactive and embodied understanding of intelligence. And you say you're from machine learning.
Yes.
So what that means, this sort of the central importance of movement, I think has yet to really hit machine learning. It certainly has now diffused itself throughout robotics, and perhaps you could say certain problems in active vision where you actually have to move the camera to sample this and that. But machine learning of the data mining, deep learning sort simply hasn't contended with this issue. What it's done, instead of dealing with the movement problem and the active sampling of data, it's just said, we don't need to worry about it. We can see all the data because we've got big data. So we can ignore movement. So that, for me, is an important omission in current machine learning.
So current machine learning is much more like the oil drop.
Yes.